Notify the Coast Guard. She's aground.
Maxim! Maxim!
Keep the shore. Come on, everybody. Come on.
Maxim! Maxim!
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Mitzi Perdue, who is a businesswoman, philanthropist, and an anti-human trafficking advocate. Welcome to the show today.
Oh, what a pleasure to be here with you.
All right. So for those that are not familiar with you, let's start with a little bit of kind of a backdrop.
All right.
Your father was Ernest Henderson, who co-founded and built the Sheraton Hotel Chain. And I wonder if you kind of go back to your childhood, what was it like growing up in your family and also seeing the business grow?
It was a fabulous experience because there were 5 of us. I was the youngest. And, you know, in families, kids have different strategies for how to get parental attention. And my strategy, which just worked like a charm, was I would ask Daddy questions about the business. Why did you do that? Why did you do this? And it was just a divine way of getting parental attention because he never held back. I think he really liked that his younger daughter wanted to know what was the magic sauce that had the company grow from no hotels to 400 at the time of his death.
I mean, that's so incredible because you're right, the family dynamics of larger family dynamics and being the youngest, and of course you do get a lot of attention because you're the baby of the family. But it's interesting that even at a young age, you figured out a hook that you knew that was going to consistently be able to engage him. So I wonder, what were some of the key insights that you learned from your father, and more importantly, kind of the value system that your family grew up with?
Thank you. Well, I'll give you the answer to one of my questions of him. Now I'm pretending at the moment that you're my father. You know, you started the company in the middle of the Great Depression. Everybody was running away from hotels, and yet you were buying them. How could you turn them around? And here's his answer. He told me that at every level, his success depended on the people who worked with him. So, of course, I asked, well, how did you get them to be so enthusiastic about following you? What were the leadership things that you did? And he told me a story, which I will now share with you. He said, every time he took over a hotel, and remember, we're talking the 1930s, the Great Depression, at least when it started, he said he'd invite all the employees into the hotel ballroom. And, you know, a major hotel can easily have 800 employees. So here are these demoralized people coming in to the hotel ballroom on the day that the new owner has taken possession. And Father told me that he knew that every one of them was just, really worried about losing their jobs. And if you lose your job during a time of 25% unemployment, which was the case back then, it meant the breadline. So he knew that they were so anxious that they probably wouldn't hear a word he said until he addressed their big issue. So he told me the first words out of his mouth were, I want every one of you to keep your job. And I want you to keep your job. I want you to stay in your job because I know that you know your job better than anybody else on the planet. And my job is to give you the resources and the encouragement to show the world just how good you are. And imagine how that must feel to somebody who's been afraid of losing his job, to hear that the big boss believes in them. Cool?
Well, that's really powerful because, again, I think it's it's an interesting strategy, actually a beautiful strategy of value-based investing and acquisition from a real estate perspective. But at the same time, when there's an acquisition, usually that change in management is going to relook at some of the balance sheet aspects, some of the costs, and part of that could easily mean divesting certain businesses and certainly laying off some people. So for him to actually commit and double down in an environment where maybe the sales are a little bit uncertain, and that commit that these people are not going to lose job is a pretty big commitment and support. So it's fascinating, really is. So,
But
and then,
there's a PS to that story, and you were kind of touching on it. Where you spend the money, do you clean house when you take over? But since his goal was, he didn't use the word, but to use a modern word, was employee engagement, wanting people to be involved and pulling for the thing to be a success. He told me that the words were important, but that hardly scratched the surface. He said throughout his career, he was always signaling to the people who worked with him how important they were to him. And his first way of doing that, other than the words, was that the next day there would be troops of like plumbers and electricians and decorators coming into the hotel to refurbish it, to spruce it up, because a hotel that's been on the verge of bankruptcy, they've let everything go to seed. But, and he told me this, he said the first money that he ever spent on any hotel that he ever bought was in areas that the public would never see. It would be the employee dining room, the employee kitchen, the employee showers and lockers. He said he did that for the very express purpose of showing them how much he valued them, because he said, and this is something that I've taken with me for the rest of my life, he said, people have a compulsion to live up to or down to your expectations.
wow, that is so powerful, really powerful. And I think, one of the things I was going to point out in these two examples that you gave is this notion of being a maverick. The fact that when others were trying to get rid of certain assets and businesses, here he is acquiring businesses. He's trying to operate, and he's trying to operate it at a level that's really probably at that time just unthinkable. And the fact that he's investing into these people first, and then the hotel, that the experience that the travelers actually see afterwards, incredible thought.
And yet he did it. He was smart enough to figure that out.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really proud of him.
Yeah. And I wonder if, some of this is very much like engineering, right? But I wonder for your father, if there was a true understanding of not only human psychology, but also empathy for the workers as well.
Well, that's a super interesting story, because his background was engineering. He had a degree from MIT in electrical engineering. And when he was 26 years old, and he just couldn't find out what he wanted to do in his life, he went to a career guidance counselor. And the guy, it was Johnson O'Connor, which is still in existence, put him through like 8 hours of tests to find out what his aptitudes were, what he was good, what he was bad at. And at the end of the 8 hours, Johnson O'Connor told my father, "You have the worst human relations skills I've ever come across." He said, "You can probably make a pretty good living as a scientist, because you're a bright fellow, in a laboratory somewhere where you don't interact with people." So how did he become a hotel? How did he get into the hospitality industry? Well, and again, he told me this. He said that he reasoned that almost all success in life comes from your ability to interact with people. And he said he spent the rest of his life trying to learn everything he could about what makes people tick. And he took psychology courses. He read psychology books. He told me that he read How to Win Friends and Influence People. Like every 10 years, he took the course. He made it his business for the rest of his life to make friends with famous psychologists like Eddie Bernays, who seems to be the father of modern advertising, I think, or B.F. Skinner, who was a professor of Harvard at the time. And, these people would be guests in our house, and he's picking their brains, trying to grasp at a deeper level what makes people tick. And I think that his greatest deficit became his greatest strength because he put so much effort into realizing, hey, I suck at this. I gotta learn. And he did.
Wow, that's just incredible. I mean, I think this goes beyond emotional intelligence. I mean, he's really taken a scientific mind and trying to deconstruct and analyze every piece and thought of, how are people motivated, what are the certain incentive structures, what's the environment. And I love the fact that he's really invested in and continue to refine that process. And certainly by the empire that he's built in his lifetime, you could see that it's been very successful. Now, transitioning to your last name, of course, your late husband was leader who started the Perdue chicken business. But we're going to actually come back to that towards the end, because there's a book that's coming out called Frank Perdue Way that maybe we could talk a little bit more about. But let's talk about another aspect of something that you've actually spearheaded, which is called the Ceres Farms. For those that are not as familiar, you yourself also have a business of your own that you created. You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit askyourperkins.com/events.
All right. In 1968, I'm misspeaking. My father passed away in 1967, and it was very unexpected, because back in 1967, people weren't putting as much thought into planning for the future as we do today. Things that we just take for granted now wasn't part of the thinking back then. And when he died suddenly at age 70, it was unexpected. I was, at that time, I think I was 27 years old, and suddenly I had this great big inheritance. But I think since we had been brought up with the idea of stewardship, and that it was our responsibility to hand on what we inherited in better shape to those who came after us, I felt I could put this great big stack of money into the stock market. I did put some in, but I wanted to do something maybe more meaningful than just have somebody else look after it. So I was living in California at the time. I spent 4 years studying agriculture and as an investment. And I'd study things like agronomy, agricultural accounting, international trade in agriculture. I really did spend 4 years on this. And I also examined like 40 different agricultural properties with the idea that is where my money would go, because agriculture is so interesting. I love it with all my heart, because you do it well and you feed people. You come up with new ideas, and it can have an impact throughout the globe. So I guess it was 1974, I bought my first property. And with the profits that I made from having it managed well, I bought more and more. And right now, Ceres Farms, it is one of the larger vineyards in California. We supply like Robert Mondavi, Joel Gott, Kendall Jackson, just a whole lot of names that you've heard. And we're one of the suppliers, but we're a big one, to 12 different vineyards. I'm trying to say wineries. And I find that very satisfying. I love everything about agriculture.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that you bring up, because certainly could you have the same return on investment or IRR through other types of forms of investments and alternative investments, but something about the earth, going back to the earth, being able to touch the soil, being able to work it and actually yield something that's tangible, not just simply to see, but also for consumption, that provides,
As you're saying, absolutely, and I'm agreeing with you 100%, but the rate of return, part of my inheritance was in a trust managed by a bank. I know what it's worth today. I know where my investments in land have led me, it's verging on that I have $100 earned from agriculture for every $1 that the stock market got me. Agricultural land, at least bought right and back in 1974 or in the 70s before, I mean, right now, forgive me for boasting, but I kind of feel that I saw the future that Bill Gates sees today. He's buying agricultural land, but my feeling was they're not making a whole lot more of it. It will always be needed. And I wanted to be a good steward.
Very interesting indeed. And you're right about Bill Gates. And the thing with land is it's, we think about in terms of what we see on the surface, certainly in terms of agriculture, but there's also value underneath as well. I know of family businesses that have actually kind of accidentally found that there's minerals and incredible valuable resources underneath that they were able to mine as well. So incredible, very interesting. So let's transition to talk about one of your other passions, which is around anti-human trafficking efforts through your organization called Win This Fight. Can you tell us the genesis of this?
The genesis of it was 2019. I heard a lecture that absolutely changed my life, and it was something that I couldn't unhear. I heard a man named Paul Hutchinson was giving a lecture at a family business conference, and he talked about girls, actually there are hundreds of thousands of them, who might be 12 years old, who are sold up to 12 times, maybe even 20 times a night. They're forced to have sex with strangers, and their life expectancy is generally not longer than 7 years because they're going to die of suicide, overdose, or maybe be murdered for their organs. And I thought, there just doesn't exist anything more horrendous. And so I decided to spend the rest of my life trying to combat this problem.
I mean, it's a topic that's incredibly difficult to discuss, right? And certainly for those of us that are parents, to imagine something like this to our kids is just horrific.
It's got to stop. Society has to just say, end it.
Well, so there are a lot of course, you've been in this for many years, so you understand the complexities around it. But for everything from income inequality to just economic lack of opportunities, but also changing things like climate change and movements of people and refugees. Can you talk about some of the factors that's making it worse?
Okay, but first of all, I want to stipulate that I'm not going to be able to cure it, but I want to do what I can. Mm-hmm. And as for climate change, when there are droughts or heat waves that make agriculture impossible, when the land degrades because of climate change, you get climate refugees. People just can't make a living on their land. They move. Who do the traffickers like best? They want people who are vulnerable, particularly economically vulnerable. When I even know of people whose academic specialty is predicting migration flows depending on climate change. And we know that wherever these predicted refugee flows are going to happen, that the traffickers are right in there going after them. And the economics of being a trafficker, well, let me give you a statistic from New York, and I have this from multiple NYPD people that I'm friends with. If you're a trafficker in New York and you got a girl, it could be a boy, but for the moment, let's just say a girl, you get a girl from maybe Haiti, but wherever. When you get a girl, you can sell her 7, 8, 20 times a night. You can make, if you have 4 girls, you can make $1 million a year tax-free, and your odds of paying a penalty of this are close to zero. The traffickers are close to never prosecuted. The ones you hear about, they're the rare case. They're not the usual case.
So it's, again, very disturbing to hear. And I think the other thing is oftentimes we think of traffickers being distant and people that are unrelated, but oftentimes it's a full system of interlocking activities and people, right? So it's actually the relatives, or maybe it's people within the town or the village that's trying to exploit others. And so there's a lot of people involved in this kind of chain of things that culminates into human trafficking. Where are some of the opportunities that your organization, for example, but others are injecting to help to dismantle these set of activities and
Okay,
profit?
and I so agree. It's, there are all these interlocking things. How do you get your hands around it? But I think there's hope. UBS, the financial institution, that's, as far as I can tell, I think that's their biggest effort. And here's what they're doing. In Bangladesh, they have as a goal to wipe out human trafficking in the country of Bangladesh. How are they doing it? They're working to get every possible thing that we know about shutting down trafficking. And as an example, one of the just weaknesses of attempts to go after trafficking is the traffickers have hundreds of millions, actually billions of dollars to bribe law enforcement and to bribe politicians. And that's among the reasons that they never get prosecuted, or they seldom get prosecuted. What UBS is doing is it's attacking the problem of human trafficking, income inequality, educational inequality, circumstances where a family is so desperate that they might have no choice but to sell one child to keep the other 5 alive. Or I've mentioned the law enforcement, but throughout the world, I'm aware through the United Nations of 20,000 different organizations that are trying to attack the problem. What UBS is doing is trying to get the best ideas, the best wisdom, the best experience to bring it all to bear on one country and see what it takes with adequate money and adequate knowledge to end it in one country. And then there are a whole lot of academics who are studying this, learn what the best practices are, learn what works and what doesn't work, and then expand it out and eventually reach the rest of the world. And the time frame for this, the United Nations would like to have human trafficking eliminated by 2030. And I'm not sure that they'll get there, but this seems, of everything that I've read and studied, the idea of having best practices for how you really get it done in one country could make a difference throughout the world.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and of course, just to be clear, I'm sure the bank is working with lots of other NGOs.
Oh yes.
Profits. But I guess what I'm saying is the best practices. I think there are some things that are certainly transferable and can be applied to other regions as well. But recognizing that there's complexities and uniqueness to the local aspects and the culture that may not be necessarily replicated, let's say in Russia, for instance, or Indonesia.
I think my impression of the people who are working on this is that they're drawing from the best minds throughout the world, whether academic or NGOs. I'm certain that they would endorse your point that not everything is replicable or scalable. But even so, we're going to be farther ahead when this project is done than we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that area that connects all the way to Southeast Asia, more broadly, is that the Silk Road. So it's essentially the interior trade route where you have a lot of these activities and flow of goods, but also flow of people. So it really is very much a cross-border, cross-country, cross-region issue that needs to be resolved. So I'm so glad that you are part of this larger think tank and collective that's trying to vet out these best practices. So very, very exciting. Coming back to climate change, I want to talk about, at the time of this recording, there was a BBC report that came out indicating that there are certain nations and special interest groups that have been lobbying to water down the IPCC climate report that's coming out. And the reason for that is very obvious in the sense that many of these countries depend on oil and gas export sales. Others are selling coal, and others on the receiving side are importing these things, coal, oil, and gas, because they need to burn it to generate electricity. I wonder what's your response to this shocking, but rather really in some ways kind of expected news? Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astorperkins.com and click on Events.
The only thing I can talk about with any authority is what Perdue's doing. We're one of the few companies our size, and at the moment we employ 21,000 people. We're one of the few companies our size which has received a Platinum Leadership and Environment award. We are an outstanding leader in solar. If you were to drive by our headquarters, a field that once grew corn, now we're growing electricity. It's a mammoth size for, to my mind, that there are all these solar panels, and the sophistication with which we have become so energy efficient. I was talking with the engineer who set these, I don't know how many panels they are, but to my eye, it looks like thousands. He says that they are so finely tuned that he gets phone calls from people, say, in a building somewhere that's fed by this electricity, saying, the needle suddenly went down. We're not getting as much. And he said, that's because it's so sensitive that if it's a sunny day and a cloud goes by, we capture the difference it makes. And I'm saying that just to explain that the technology is spectacular, but we have all these wonderful ways of saving water, of recycling everything that you can think of. You don't get to be LEED Platinum without putting a lot of effort and care and commitment into it. Oh, and then on top of that, we are the largest producer of organic chicken in the world. And we have some spectacular ways of energy saving. And I'll share one with you. It's something that we've been experimenting with, and it's not a huge part of the company, but I hope it will be soon. Our chickens are pasture raised, but by the way, let me quickly say they're not all pasture raised. This is what we're aiming towards, but I can describe something that's happening right now. I want you to imagine hundreds of football field sized paddocks. And a paddock, it's this fenced area. But in the case of the chickens, we actually grow several animals, for example, cattle and swine. So in one of these fields, it's a huge field, and you've got this mobile paddock. It's on rails, and it's solar power, so it moves very, very slowly. But the first one would have beef animals. There's tall grass. The animals munch it down to it's the size that's just really good for swine. They graze the crops down, or the grass down to a size that they're happy with, but meanwhile they're leaving all their droppings and stomping them into the ground. The paddock keeps moving forward. The next animal, and I think we're talking swine, but they might have gone with sheep, I'm not quite sure, but the sheep will eat it down to a level that's just right for the chickens to eat. So that let's say it's sheep, they're leaving their droppings, enriching the soil. The paddock moves on, and then behind that, so we've had a paddock that's moving with beef animals. Behind that is a paddock that has sheep or swine. I'm just not sure which at this moment. And then behind that is the part that excites me most. It's the chickens. Chickens don't really graze on grass all that much. It's just the right height. They could, but here's what the chickens love. All the bugs that were on the great big tall grass out of reach of them have now moved down to the level that's just right for the chickens to munch on them. So the chickens get all the bugs that they love, and there's never any antibiotics, no hormones. These are just pasture raised chickens, but it increases the fertility of the soil enormously to have 3 different kinds of animals stomping their droppings into the ground. And when you see what happens to the grass in the areas where there's a paddock, and then like the few feet in between the next paddock, you can fly over with a drone, and it's the most amazing thing. The areas where the animals have been, the grass is just green and lush and it grows. You see the areas that didn't have the treatment of the fertilizer from the animals, and the grass is kind of short, yellowish. It looks as if it's trying to grow on bricks. And what this does for the environment, as well as for the health of the animals, I think it's spectacular, and we're doing it.
Yeah, I really like this example, because what we're talking about is this notion of how using best practices and techniques effectively reducing the use of fertilizers, pesticides, right? And then, of course, having to, systematically grow this food source for the animals, but they're essentially kind of creating a circular regenerative farming type of an environment. Now, of course, these are huge.
May I interrupt? Because I'm worried that I allow me to just reassure myself that I made it clear that this is what we're aiming for to do.
Understood. Understood. Absolutely. Makes sense. And thank you for that. But there are still, large issues, right? So we have seen issues around water contamination, some of these things seeping into the water tables. So there are a lot of issues. But with that said, I think the key importance is we know that the poultry business, the cattle business, these are not going to go away anytime soon. I have a follow-up question on this one. But the fact that there's systematic effort and initiative to improve in a more natural, organic way, I think is very commendable. The follow-up question I have is, of course, Perdue is incented to continue to produce and process chickens. However, there's also movement for clean meat. And I wanted to see if you had any opinions about clean meat, and whether it's cell-based meats or even plant-based meats that try to mimic poultry texture and flavor.
Well, that's such an interesting question, because years ago, when we were deciding that we would be an organic company, some members of the family were saying, well, but what about plant-based protein? And we're not against it, but we felt that our customer base in general tends to be very real foods rather than fake foods, and that so we were that our direction as a company, that our niche was organic. No pesticides, no herbicides, no hormones, no antibiotics. That was our niche, and we can't cover the waterfront and do everything, but this would be our specialty.
Understood. Makes sense.
But we do something that I think is just spectacular. I'm so proud of Jim Perdue. I hardly know what to do with myself. But somewhere a few years ago, the meat industry in general seems to be like at loggerheads with environmentalists and animal rights people. Jim created an animal welfare summit in which we invited all our critics to come and tell us, that would just meet and talk with each other about what we can do, what we'd like to do, what we needed to do. And they were kind of shocked to be invited, because he actually invited them for dinner at our house. And I think, or actually his house. I don't know how many there were there, but I could guess 30. And when they talk with him as, not the enemy, but just somebody that we're trying to solve a problem, we want to grow chickens in the most humane, best way possible. And we made all sorts of changes because of them. And, I think we're 4 years into this, but I'm losing track of the years, but it turns out over and over again that they're our biggest advocates now, and they really appreciate that we're making changes that, in the end, we're on the same side. And I'm loving that Jim reached out to them and said, let's work together to do the best we can.
So this is actually a really interesting segue, because in the beginning of the conversation, we're talking about your father and how he systematically really enhanced his ability to understand human psychology and to work with people as a collective, whether it's an organization or a community or a cause, to really make big changes happen. And certainly you're doing that through anti-human trafficking efforts as well. So this last story that you share through Jim is also very interesting as well. And I want to come back to this notion of family businesses and how family businesses can last across generations. And I know that you have previously written a book called How to Make Your Family Business Last. Any key insights that you can share with the audience that are listening right now?
Yeah, the Perdue family, we're now in our 101st year. The Henderson family began in 1840. So Sheraton was just one of the things that the family's been involved in. People ask me, what has made your two families last so long? And I have two answers for it. The first is kids need to be brought up with a sense of stewardship, that that their job as citizens of this planet is to make the company as good as it can be, and that get your identity out of service rather than out of spending. If I could wave a magic wand and change something huge in America, I'd have our egos tied up with serving others, making the world a better place rather than that you can buy the latest designer thing. So stewardship is one, and I think you have to teach kids that from the youngest age, because it's so easy to grow up selfish and entitled. But no, teach them that we're here for service. That's number one. And by the way, that's hugely tied up with philanthropy. I have read that almost no family makes it to the third generation if they haven't discovered the bonding power of philanthropy. Because philanthropy, I hope it's good for whoever is the recipient of the philanthropy, but it's fabulous for the family because, again, you want your identity to be that you're doing good in the world, not that you're just spending. The other thing that I think makes families last is it's just really important to know your family's stories, because outside in the world, there's so many centrifugal forces that lead you to things that make you not a high-functioning family, like drugs, getting in trouble with the law, having children before you're ready to have children. There's so many things that pull you apart in a negative way. Instead, know the family stories, the effort it took to get to where we are now, the sacrifices, the setbacks, maybe even the bankruptcies, but know the family stories so that you're part of something bigger than yourself.
So on that note, I wonder, because in your case, you've seen both through your father as well as your late husband, the effort, the hard work, the sheer just pull up your boots and get it done. But as the generation gets, successive and get into 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th generation and centuries later, holding on to that story is one thing, but it feels very conceptual, very ethereal. How can those later generations really kind of imbue and be able to actually really empathize and feel those struggles when they themselves don't have to go through those struggles?
In both the Henderson and the Perdue family, the kids never had a whole lot of money just to slather around. They in both families, they all have jobs. And you can't work for the family business until you've worked like 3 or 4 or 5 years elsewhere, sort of to have a more real world approach to things. But how do you have the family story keep on? Well, I'm going to describe something that the Hendersons do, but I don't know if it would apply to any other family in the world, but here it is. We have a rule that by the time you're 60, you have to write your autobiography. And we all read each other's. Going back to, there's a library in the family home that is just stacked with books upon books and books. I can go back to learning what was going on in 1820. And it's so cool to know what your ancestors thought and struggled with. Another thing that both families do is we have had family histories written, and then we also have newsletters, and the Perdue family has a Perdue museum, and I happened to be visiting it just yesterday, so it's very much in my mind. But it has recordings of Frank Perdue speaking. It has photographs of the house he was born in. It has quotes from his father. It's just so cool when you know where you came from.
Hmm. So let's talk about this book that's coming out, Frank Perdue Way. And what can potential readers expect from this little book?
I wrote the book because it's part of a series. The others aren't by me, but General Patton, Hershey, Carnegie, Disney. Okay, what were the factors that made them a success? And the publisher came to me and said, would you write something like that about Frank? So I'm thinking, what are some of the things that he did? Because I wanted to pick only things that help you forward in success, but that were doable. And since Frank started out as with his father as a chicken farmer, at the end of his life, he was employing 20,000 people. So what are some of the things that he did? Well, like my father, he was very, very big on developing employee engagement, because like my father, he also said that the entire reason for his success was that he got to work with really smart people. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you can do to motivate people to go the extra mile for you? And here's some of the things that I noticed about him, and I wrote about them. But he always said, I'm not all that smart. And he was a B student in school and in college. So, he wasn't Einstein, although I think he was very, very smart, but he wasn't an Einstein. But what he did say was that he listened to smart people. He surrounded himself with smart people, and he would listen. And with Frank Perdue, listening was different from how I've ever seen anybody else do it. We were together for 17 years before his passing. And I noticed that if he were talking with you, or if he were talking with, say, a group of salesmen or whoever he's with, he would listen 90% of the time and talk only 10% of the time. And, again, that's whether it's one-on-one or whether it's with a group. He was very interested in what you thought and what you had to say. And when he was talking with you, he had this way of just like enveloping you with his just total concentration. And you got the feeling that you're the most important person in his world when he's speaking. Mm-hmm. And I think that made you feel 10 feet tall, that an important man was just really interested in what you had to say. Mm-hmm. And then another thing that he did, and this is advice for people who maybe they're in a managerial position, but when Frank would enter a room, and he told me that his attitude was, there are really a lot of smart people in this room, and my job is to tap into the smarts of each of the people here. What he would do would be, again, his goal is to tap into the intelligence of the other people. I noticed that his posture when he was doing that, he wasn't being the great, big, successful, take up space CEO, president, manager. No, he would have almost a shy, well, no, that's not a correct way of describing it. His posture was kind of small gestures and not sucking up all the oxygen out of the room. Instead, his posture was, I'm part of the team. I'm not the boss of the whole thing. And people would talk much more spontaneously. I think they'd say what they really thought. Mm-hmm. But then that builds into another thing, which is when he wanted something done, and again, say we're in a meeting of a dozen people who are tasked with whatever it is, he would let them know what the goal is, but he'd leave it to them to figure out how to get there, mm-hmm. which meant that they owned it. They felt important. They felt respected. I loved his technique of telling people what the goal is, but I'm going to support you and how you get there.
Amazing. Wow. I'm definitely listening, and I have a feeling that the audience is listening intently as well. I wish we could continue, but we are a little bit out of time. My last question for you before we wrap up is, what gets you up in the morning? And you mentioned the autobiography as an example, but what really gets you up in the morning? And what is that legacy you're trying to leave behind?
Well, I'm going to give a quote from Frank Perdue, it's part of his ethical will, advice for those who came after him. He said, if you want to be happy, think what you can do for somebody else. You really want to be miserable, think what's owed to you. So what gets me up in the morning? At least this is what I aspire to and want to, and I don't plan to carry it out perfectly, but I like the idea, if you want to be happy, think what you can do for somebody else. So I get up in the morning thinking, what can I do?
Beautiful. With that, I have been joined by Mitzi Perdue, who is a businesswoman, philanthropist, and an anti-human trafficking advocate. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.